The Ghost Town Express, Chapter 1, The Unexpected Stop. The rumble of the Greyhound bus was usually a lullaby to Evelyn Reed. At 60 years old, with a lifetime of Baltimore behind her and the recent quiet void left by her husband's passing still echoing in her small apartment, bus journeys had become a refuge. She was on her way to Charleston, South Carolina, to visit her niece, a bright, bustling young woman Evelyn rarely saw. It was a journey meant to distract, to carry her away from the familiar grief that clung to her like a shroud. She wanted to forget, if only for a few days, the quiet house, the unspoken memories, and the much older, deeper wound that festered beneath it all. The death of her younger brother, Jacob. 40 years had passed since that devastating phone call, since the police report that offered more questions than answers. Accidental fall, they'd said, in St. Augustine, Florida. Jacob, barely 20, vibrant and full of the restless energy of youth, had gone down to Florida on a whim, chasing a dream he never quite articulated. And then he was gone, a void, a lifetime of what-ifs. St. Augustine had become a name Evelyn never spoke, a geographical marker of unbearable pain. The hum of the bus, the gentle sway, and the monotonous drone of the engine lulled Evelyn into a deep, dreamless sleep. She remembered the last glimpse of the neon glow of a roadside diner, the distant murmur of other passengers. Then darkness, a profound, consuming quiet. When Evelyn slowly, groggily opened her eyes, the bus was still. The engine had fallen silent. The rhythmic hum was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. The world outside the window was bathed in the pale, milky light of dawn, or perhaps very early morning. She stretched, a crick in her neck, and looked around. The bus was empty, completely, utterly empty. Not a single passenger, no driver, no bags in the overhead compartments. Just the faint, lingering scent of stale coffee and disinfectant. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at her. Where was everyone? Had she slept through a stop? She fumbled for her phone, but her purse, usually tucked securely by her feet, was gone. Her small carry-on, resting on the seat beside her, had vanished too. A cold dread began to coil in her stomach. She peered out the window. They weren't at the bustling, brightly lit Charleston terminal. This was different, very different. The bus was parked in a small, deserted lot, gravel crunching under her shoes as she finally stood up and carefully stepped down the bus steps. The building before her was a small, dilapidated structure, once presumably a bus station, but now boarded up, its windows shattered, paint peeling like sunburnt skin. The sign, faded and barely legible, read St. Augustine Depot. St. Augustine. The name hit her with the force of a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. Not Charleston, St. Augustine, the very name that had been a silent, agonizing phantom in her life for 4 decades. The city where Jacob had died. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, the kind of heavy, humid air that clung to your skin. The street was narrow, lined with old, weathered buildings, many of them empty, their eyes staring out blankly. A single ancient oak tree, draped in Spanish moss, stood sentinel at the corner. Its branches gnarled and twisted, looking like arthritic fingers reaching for the sky. There was no one, no cars, no pedestrians, no sound but the distant, mournful cry of a seagull. It felt like a ghost town, a city trapped in amber, preserved but lifeless. Evelyn's mind reeled. How could this be? Had the bus veered off course? Had she been abandoned? It defied logic. Her itinerary was clear. Baltimore to Charleston, a direct route. No stops in Florida. It was impossible. Yet, here she was, in St. Augustine, the city she had spent a lifetime avoiding, the place that embodied her deepest, most unresolved sorrow. A strange, magnetic pull began to draw her forward, away from the abandoned bus, away from the silent station. It was a feeling she couldn't explain, a whisper from the depths of her soul. As if the city itself, the very air, was calling to her, inviting her to step into its desolate embrace, to confront the past she had so desperately tried to outrun. It was terrifying, yet undeniably compelling. This wasn't a random error. This felt like destiny. A final, unavoidable confrontation. And Evelyn, despite her fear, felt an unsettling certainty. She was meant to be here. The ghost of Jacob, it seemed, had finally found a way to call her home. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Alleyways. The morning light in St. Augustine, even in its desolate state, held a certain ancient beauty, illuminating the faded pastels of colonial architecture. But for Evelyn, it was a harsh, unforgiving light, revealing the crumbling facades of buildings and the decaying dreams they once held. She walked through the empty streets, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the mournful calls of distant gulls and the faint, unsettling whisper of the wind through the Spanish moss. Every shadow seemed to hold a memory, every creaking door an untold story. She passed an old diner, its windows grimy, chairs overturned inside, a faded, open sign hanging askew. A barber shop, its striped pole rusted, seemed frozen in time. It was as if the city had simply stopped, like a film reel paused abruptly in the middle of a scene. A peculiar feeling began to prickle at Evelyn's skin, a sense of déjà vu, unsettlingly precise. She hadn't been to St. Augustine since Jacob's funeral, a brief, pain-filled blur of a trip 40 years ago. Yet certain alleyways, certain crooked lampposts felt strangely familiar, as if she had walked them in a dream. Then she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible melody, drifting from an open, dark doorway of what looked like an abandoned music shop, a melancholic, haunting tune on an old, out-of-tune piano. It was a piece Jacob used to play, a simple, improvisational melody he'd hummed constantly in his teenage years. Evelyn froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her blood ran cold. Was she hallucinating? Was grief finally catching up to her, playing cruel tricks on her mind? She hurried towards the sound, her steps quickening. The shop was dark, dusty. The piano, a grand old upright, stood in the center, bathed in a single shaft of weak sunlight filtering through a boarded-up window. No one was there. The music faded, leaving only silence. Evelyn reached out a trembling hand, touching the cold ivory keys. They seemed to hum with a residual vibration, a ghost note. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a raw plea into the empty space. She stumbled out of the music shop, shaken. This wasn't just a wrong turn, not just an abandoned bus. This was something deeper, something profoundly personal and deeply unsettling. The city was speaking to her. Or Jacob was. As she walked on, a gust of wind caught a piece of debris, scattering it across her path. It was a crumpled, yellowed newspaper clipping. She bent down, her fingers trembling as she smoothed it out. The headline, in bold, stark print, screamed, "Local teen dies in tragic fall from old lighthouse." Below it, a grainy black and white photograph of Jacob's young, smiling face. The date, exactly 40 years ago. The paper, the St. Augustine Chronicle. Evelyn's eyes scanned the article. Jacob Reed, 20, of Baltimore, found at the base of the abandoned old St. Augustine lighthouse, deemed accidental, no foul play suspected. But then, a detail she hadn't remembered, a small paragraph near the end. Witnesses reported seeing Mr. Reed speaking with an unidentified young woman near the lighthouse earlier that evening. She has not been located. An unidentified young woman. This was new. 40 years ago, in her haze of grief, Evelyn had barely registered the details. Her parents, shell-shocked, had simply accepted the official explanation. Accidental fall. But a witness? An unidentified woman? Why had that never been followed up? Why had she never been mentioned? A new emotion, cold and sharp, cut through her grief. Suspicion. The accidental fall suddenly felt less like an accident and more like a carefully constructed narrative. The silence from the city, the haunting melody, the newspaper clipping, they were all threads in a tapestry, slowly, eerily, revealing a different picture. She knew then she couldn't leave. Not now. This was not a random misdirection. This was a direct summons. St. Augustine held the truth about Jacob, the truth she had unknowingly buried along with her grief. And she, Evelyn, was finally ready to unearth it. The city, once a symbol of her profound loss, now felt like a desperate plea for justice. A silent accusation. She had to stay. She had to understand. Chapter 3. The Skeptic and the Seeker. Days bled into a strange, dreamlike existence for Evelyn in the silent, ancient city. She found a small, run-down motel still seemingly open, run by an elderly, taciturn woman who asked no questions. Evelyn paid cash, grateful for the anonymity. She spent her hours walking the deserted streets, visiting the old lighthouse that loomed like a skeletal finger against the horizon. Its silence more profound than any noise. She went to the old police station, now also abandoned, its windows smashed, dust motes dancing in the sunlit emptiness. Her heart ached with every step, every faded memory, every unanswered question. She was a ghost in a ghost town, searching for a ghost. One afternoon, drawn by an inexplicable pull, Evelyn found herself in front of a small, dilapidated building near the city's historic center. The sign above the door, barely clinging to its rusted hinges, read "The Old Curiosity Shop and Library." It looked long abandoned, its windows opaque with dust, but a faint glimmer of light seemed to emanate from within. Evelyn pushed the heavy, creaking door open, a cloud of dust rising around her. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old paper, mildew, and forgotten dreams. Bookshelves, once grand, sagged under the weight of decaying volumes. In the very back, hunched over a cluttered desk, bathed in the beam of a single, flickering desk lamp, was a man. He was roughly Evelyn's age, perhaps a little younger, with tired eyes, a perpetually furrowed brow, and the worn, weary look of someone who had seen too much. His hair was streaked with gray, his shoulders slumped. He wore a rumpled tweed jacket despite the humidity. He looked up, startled by Evelyn's sudden appearance, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice gravelly, laced with a world-weariness that instantly resonated with Evelyn. I don't know," Evelyn admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought this place was closed. I'm Evelyn Reed." The man studied her for a moment, then sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Benjamin Crawford. Folks call me Ben. I'm retired, mostly. Just keeping busy." His gaze lingered on her, as if searching for something. "You're not from around here." "No," Evelyn said, feeling an inexplicable urge to confide in him. "I'm from Baltimore. My brother, he died here 40 years ago, Jacob Reed." At the mention of Jacob's name, a subtle shift occurred in Ben's tired eyes. A flicker of recognition, a spark of something akin to pain. He pushed aside a stack of old maps and leaned forward. "Jacob Reed?" he repeated, his voice softer now, almost hushed. "I know that name. I was the junior detective on that case, Robert Crawford. But everyone called me Ben. It was my first big case, my first failure." Evelyn stared at him, speechless. Of all the people to meet in this deserted town, in this forgotten library, it felt like a preordained encounter. "You were the detective?" she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "But they called it an accident. No foul play. You investigated it?" Ben nodded slowly, his gaze distant, lost in the shadows of the past. "Officially, yes, accident. But unofficially, I never bought it. There were too many loose ends, too many things that didn't quite fit. A kid like Jacob, full of life, adventurous, but not reckless. And the girl, the one they said he was seen with, she vanished without a trace." He shook his head, a ghost of frustration crossing his face. "I was young, inexperienced. They pulled me off the case quickly. Superior officers. Said it was open and shut. But I always felt it was more. It haunted me." He paused, his eyes meeting hers, a shared sorrow passing between them. "I lost my own daughter years later. A different tragedy. But it brings you back to the unfinished business, the things you couldn't fix. So I moved here, a quiet place, to be closer to the ghosts. The ghost of my brother has been calling me," Evelyn confessed, her voice thick with emotion. She quickly recounted her surreal journey on the bus, the inexplicable stop in St. Augustine, the empty streets, the phantom piano music, the newspaper clipping. She showed him the article, highlighting the mention of the unidentified girl. Ben listened intently, his skepticism battling with a profound sense of recognition. He was a man of logic, a detective, but he had also known the deep, irrational pull of unresolved grief, the way it could twist reality. And Evelyn's story, as bizarre as it sounded, carried the unmistakable ring of truth, a desperation he intimately understood. "The bus, it's gone, isn't it?" Ben asked, a hint of something unsaid in his voice. "Yes," Evelyn confirmed, puzzled by the question. "Completely, and my things are gone too." Ben walked over to an old, cracked globe in the corner, tracing a finger along its worn surface. "There are stories, old whispers around here about that bus line. The Ghost Town Express, they called it. A superstition that sometimes when someone has unfinished business in St. Augustine, the old bus, the one that ran the original coastal route decades ago, will take them here when they're ready to face the truth. And it only leaves you if you're meant to stay." He turned, his gaze fixed on Evelyn. "And it seems, Mrs. Reed, you were meant to stay. Your brother's ghost is finally ready to speak." A shiver ran down Evelyn's spine. A superstition. A ghost bus. It was too wild, too fantastical to believe. That she was here. And Ben, the detective who had never given up on Jacob, was here too. It was time. Time to stop running. Time to finally listen to the echoes of the past. Chapter 4. The Lighthouse's Secret. the revelation of the Ghost Town Express superstition, however outlandish, solidified a profound truth for Evelyn. She was here for a reason. This wasn't chance. This was a summons. And Ben, the haunted, weary detective, was her guide. His quiet conviction, his shared sense of unfinished business, provided the anchor Evelyn desperately needed in this surreal situation. The official report stated Jacob fell from the top of the lighthouse, Ben explained, as they drove in his ancient, rust-pocked pickup truck towards the coast. The salty wind whipping through the open windows. But the injuries, they were odd, consistent with a fall, yes, but there were other abrasions, contusions that didn't quite fit the narrative of a simple tumble. And no one could explain how he got up there. The lighthouse was already decaying, boarded up. It was incredibly dangerous. The old St. Augustine lighthouse stood stark against the sky, a gaunt, weathered sentinel. Its brickwork was crumbling, its lantern room a skeletal cage, the glass long gone. The entrance was a gaping maw, dark and ominous. The entire structure felt like a forgotten tomb. "This is where they found him," Ben said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, but his eyes betrayed a profound sadness. He pointed to a patch of overgrown grass at the base. "Right here." Evelyn walked slowly, her steps heavy, drawn by an invisible force to the very spot. She closed her eyes, trying to picture Jacob here, young and vibrant, full of life. What had truly happened? The official story was a hollow shell, devoid of the human truth. There was an old, rusted metal box, Ben recalled, pointing to a dark, damp crevice near the base of the lighthouse, hidden partially by overgrown vines. Full of what we thought was just old tools. We cataloged it, but dismissed it. No relevance to the accident. But now, knowing what I know about these places, about what people hide, it gnaws at me. Evelyn's gaze fell on the crevice. It was narrow, dark, almost invisible unless you were specifically looking for it. She reached in, feeling for something, anything. Her fingers brushed against cold, damp stone, then something smooth, metallic. She pulled it out. It was a small, ornate silver locket, tarnished with age, clutched in her hand. It felt impossibly cold. "This wasn't there 40 years ago," Ben said, his brow furrowed. "We searched thoroughly. I remember every inch of this place. Or maybe it was there, but it was missed." He took the locket from her, examining it carefully. It was old, intricate, with a delicate engraving of a stylized sea turtle on its surface. "It's beautiful," Evelyn whispered. "It feels personal." She pressed the clasp. It clicked open. Inside, on one side, was a tiny, faded photograph of a young woman, the same woman from the newspaper clipping, Evelyn realized with a jolt. Her hair was wild, her eyes bright, a defiant spark in them. On the other side, tucked into a barely visible recess, was a tiny folded piece of paper. Ben carefully unfolded it. It was a crude, hastily drawn map, a rough sketch of St. Augustine, highlighting 3 locations: the lighthouse, a prominent, long-abandoned building labeled Old County Hospital, and a small, almost imperceptible X marked near the hospital. And scribbled beside the X in a shaky hand, Jacob's handwriting, unmistakable. "She's there. Help her. Don't tell them. The truth hides in plain sight." Evelyn gasped, tears springing to her eyes. "She's there? The girl? He was trying to help her?" A wave of understanding, terrible and profound, washed over her. Jacob hadn't been reckless. He had been a hero. He had died trying to save someone. Ben's face was grim. old county hospital. It's been abandoned for 30 years. A crumbling shell. What could be there? A witness, Evelyn said, her voice filled with a desperate conviction. Someone who saw what happened. Someone Jacob was trying to protect. She might still be alive, or someone there knows something. This isn't an accident, Ben. This is a cover-up. And Jacob was involved in something much bigger than we ever imagined. The lighthouse, once a symbol of Jacob's senseless death, now pulsed with a new, urgent energy. It wasn't a tomb. It was a beacon, a monument to his bravery, and a promise of long-delayed truth. Chapter 5. The Silent Witness. The old county hospital loomed before them, a monstrous, decaying edifice. Its broken windows, like vacant eyes, staring out onto a forgotten world. The air around it hung heavy with the scent of damp concrete, decay, and the chilling silence of forgotten suffering. Urban legend held it was haunted, and Evelyn could feel the weight of countless untold stories clinging to its crumbling walls. This place was shuttered quickly after the incident with Jacob, Ben explained, his voice low, almost reverent, as they picked their way through the overgrown courtyard. There were rumors about questionable practices, strange disappearances, but nothing was ever proven. It just closed down. They found an unlocked service entrance, a heavy steel door rusted on its hinges, groaning a protest as Ben pushed it open. Inside, darkness swallowed them. The air was thick with dust, the floor littered with debris, fallen plaster, and the ghostly outlines of overturned gurneys. The corridors stretched endlessly, disappearing into the black. Jacob's map points to the old nurse's station, Evelyn whispered, shining her flashlight ahead. He wrote, "She's there. Help her." They moved cautiously through the labyrinthine corridors, guided by the flickering beams of their flashlights, their footsteps echoing eerily in the vast silence. They passed patient rooms, their beds stripped bare, medical equipment rusted and broken. The ghost of human pain hung in the air. As they reached the nurse's station, a small enclosed area filled with overturned charts and scattered papers, Evelyn noticed a faint, almost imperceptible light coming from a small back office. A shiver ran down her spine. "Ben," she whispered, "someone's here." They pushed the door open. The room was small, cramped. In the center, bundled in blankets, perched on an old salvaged gurney, was an elderly woman. She was frail, her hair white, her face deeply lined, but her eyes, though clouded with age, held a piercing intelligence. She was meticulously sorting through old patient files by the weak glow of a single, battery-powered lantern. She looked up, startled, her hand flying to her chest. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice raspy, a faint tremor in it. "This place is closed. You shouldn't be here." "My name is Evelyn Reed," Evelyn said, stepping forward, her heart pounding. "This is Detective Benjamin Crawford. We're looking for answers about a young man named Jacob Reed. He died here 40 years ago, and a young woman who was with him." The old woman's eyes widened, a flicker of something akin to fear, then deep sorrow passing through them. "Jacob," she whispered, the name a fragile sigh. "I knew Jacob. He was a good boy, too good for this place. I am Sister Mary. I was a nurse here back then. I never left. I couldn't." Sister Mary, a witness. Evelyn felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with overwhelming emotion. Sister Mary, Jacob's last words, were what he tried to communicate. What did he want you to know? What happened to the girl? Sister Mary's gaze darted around the room, as if ghosts were listening. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It wasn't an accident. Not an accident at all. Jacob, he was trying to save her. She was brought in, badly hurt. Not a car accident, no. She'd been beaten, tortured. They were after her. She was a witness to a smuggling ring. They used the old lighthouse to bring in packages, illegal goods, and they hurt her badly. She saw their faces. Evelyn and Ben exchanged a look of grim understanding. Smuggling. This was bigger than a simple fall. Jacob, Sister Mary continued, her eyes fixed on Evelyn, a desperate urgency in them. He saw her. He knew. He was trying to help her escape. He got her out of here, out of this room. But they caught him, near the lighthouse. They pushed him, to silence him, made it look like an accident. And they came back for her. They took her away. I never saw her again. I don't know if she lived. I was so afraid. They threatened me, said they'd kill me if I ever spoke. Tears welled in her ancient eyes. I've lived with this secret, this guilt, for 40 years. Every night I hear his voice, begging me to tell the truth. He tried to give me something, before they took him away, something important, a small medallion. He said it was for his sister. Sister Mary reached into her worn habit, pulling out a small, tarnished silver medallion. It was the exact same one Evelyn had found at the lighthouse. Sister Mary opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, in the same tiny recess, there was not a paper, but a minuscule, intricately crafted silver key, hidden in plain sight, perfectly matching a small, almost invisible lock on the inside of the medallion itself. Too small to be noticed by a casual glance. He said, "The truth is locked away, but the key is with her," Sister Mary whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't understand. I was too scared. I kept it, hoping one day someone would come. Evelyn took the medallion, her fingers tracing the tiny key. Her heart was pounding, a wild, chaotic rhythm. The key, the truth, it was all real. Jacob wasn't a reckless youth who met an unfortunate end. He was a hero, fighting against a terrifying darkness. And now, after 40 years, his voice was finally being heard, echoing through the desolate halls of a forgotten hospital, speaking through a silent witness. The true story of his death, darker and more profound than she could have ever imagined, was finally beginning to reveal itself. Chapter 6, The Unlocked Truth. The tiny silver key felt impossibly heavy in Evelyn's palm, a tangible link to Jacob's final, desperate moments. It clicked perfectly into the almost invisible lock mechanism within the locket itself, a secret compartment she and Ben had not discovered earlier. With a soft click, a hidden panel on the side of the locket sprang open, revealing another, even tinier, folded piece of paper. This one was different. Not a map, not a plea. It was a precise diagram, a detailed sketch of a particular section of the old lighthouse, marked with coordinates and a series of numbers and symbols. At the bottom, a single word in Jacob's clear, determined hand. Proof. He was collecting evidence, Evelyn whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and dawning horror. He knew what they were doing. He knew they were bringing in illegal goods through the lighthouse. And he tried to stop them. He was going to expose them. Ben, his detective's mind now fully engaged, took the diagram. Coordinates, symbols. This looks like a ledger code or a manifest. He was logging their shipments. And proof. He must have hidden something there, something that would incriminate them. The small, close-knit criminal ring had used the abandoned lighthouse as a hub for their illicit activities, smuggling rare, untaxed artifacts, exotic animals, and even narcotics. Bypassing official ports of entry, they bribed local officials, turning a blind eye to their operations. Jacob, restless and curious, had stumbled upon their operation. He hadn't been afraid. He'd been outraged. He'd tried to expose them, gathering evidence, meticulously documenting their activities, aided by the young woman he tried to save, who had been a victim of their cruelty. They returned to the lighthouse, not with a sense of dread, but with a fierce, unwavering determination. This time, their search was precise, guided by Jacob's final, ingenious clue. The diagram pointed to a specific, almost imperceptible loose brick near the very top of the lighthouse, in the interior wall of the lantern room, where the wind still sang its eerie song. Ben, agile despite his age, climbed the rusted stairs, Evelyn following closely behind. He located the brick, camouflaged by years of grime and weathered mortar. With a grunt, he pried it loose. Behind it, nestled in a damp, narrow cavity, was a small, sealed metal box. It was a waterproof, tightly secured container, clearly designed to protect its contents from the elements. Inside, they found it, the meticulously kept, leather-bound ledger. It was filled with Jacob's neat, precise handwriting. Dates, quantities, types of goods, coded names, even rough sketches of the vessels used. It was a detailed, undeniable record of decades of illegal smuggling operations through the St. Augustine coast, implicating not only the smugglers but also several prominent, now elderly, local figures who had been paid to turn a blind eye, including the police chief at the time. A shocking, damning testament to systemic corruption. And tucked inside the ledger, a separate, heavily sealed envelope. It contained photographs, grainy black and white photos, taken covertly. Photos of crates being unloaded at the lighthouse under the cloak of darkness. Photos of faces, clearly identifiable, some of them still powerful figures in the community. And a single, terrifying photo. The young woman Jacob had tried to save, her face bruised and swollen. Being dragged by two men, Evelyn now recognized from the other pictures. But the most chilling discovery was a final handwritten note from Jacob, tucked into the very last page of the ledger. If you find this, it means I failed. They know I'm onto them. The girl, her name is Clara. She's a brave one. She saw everything. They'll come for her. Don't let my death be in vain. Expose them. For Clara. For St. Augustine. The truth sets us free. Evelyn collapsed onto the dusty floor of the lantern room, the ledger falling from her numb hands. Her brother. Her brave, selfless brother. He hadn't died an accidental death. He had been murdered. A hero, silenced for trying to do what was right. The tears came, hot and furious, but they were different now. Not tears of confusion or unanswered grief, but tears of righteous anger, of profound sorrow for what Jacob had endured, and a fierce, burning resolve to finally bring justice to his memory. Then, his face grim, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. We have them, Evelyn. After all these years, we finally have them. They returned to Sister Mary, who listened to their findings with quiet tears streaming down her face. Clara, she whispered, her voice filled with a desperate hope. She had a chance. He gave her a chance. And now, justice for him, my sweet Jacob. Sister Mary then revealed one last detail she had hidden, a small, worn photograph of Clara, confirming her identity, and a faint address on the back. a long-shot lead from Clara's admission papers decades ago. The evidence was overwhelming. Armed with Jacob's ledger, the photographs, Sister Mary's testimony, and Ben's expertise, they took their findings to the state authorities. Despite the passage of 40 years, the weight of the evidence, meticulously collected by a courageous young man, was undeniable. An investigation was launched, targeting the surviving members of the smuggling ring and the corrupt officials who had allowed it to flourish, burying the truth of Jacob's murder. Chapter 7: Redemption in St. Augustine. The legal proceedings were long, arduous, and emotionally draining. Spanning several months, Evelyn sat through every hearing, her presence a silent, unwavering testament to Jacob's memory. The revelations sent shockwaves through St. Augustine. Elderly, revered figures, once pillars of the community, were exposed as complicit in a decades-long criminal enterprise and the cover-up of a young man's murder. Some were still alive, facing justice in their twilight years. Others, long dead, had their reputations irrevocably tarnished. The city itself, once shrouded in a polite amnesia about Jacob's death, was forced to confront its dark past, to finally acknowledge the truth that had festered beneath its charming facade. The local newspaper, now under new ownership and committed to transparency, ran a series of investigative reports, piecing together the full, horrifying story. Jacob Reed was no longer just a statistic, a tragic accident. He was a hero. His bravery, his unwavering moral compass, his lonely fight against corruption, finally echoed throughout the city. The community responded with a mixture of shock, shame, and a profound desire for reconciliation. A small, dignified memorial was erected at the base of the old lighthouse, a plaque bearing Jacob's name and the inscription, "For the truth he sought, and the life he gave." For Evelyn, the weight lifted slowly, gradually. The knot of grief that had tightened around her heart for 40 years began to loosen, unraveling layer by agonizing layer. The phantom pains of her past began to recede, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. Her brother hadn't died meaninglessly. His death had purpose. His legacy was one of courage and justice. She realized, to her own surprise, that she couldn't leave St. Augustine. The city, once a symbol of her deepest sorrow, had become the place of her profound healing, her unexpected rebirth. The spectral quiet that had first unnerved her now felt like a comforting embrace. The whispers of history, no longer accusatory, but liberating. And in Ben Crawford, Evelyn found an unexpected companion, a kindred spirit. He had remained by her side through every step of the investigation. His quiet strength and unwavering dedication, a constant comfort. He too had found a measure of peace. The unresolved case of Jacob Reed had been his first professional failure, a ghost that haunted his career. Now, it was his greatest triumph, bringing a sense of completeness to his own life, a redemption for the daughter he had lost. They found Clara, Sister Mary's clue. The faint address from the hospital records led them to a quiet, unassuming woman living a reclusive life in a small town a few hours away. She had survived, scarred, traumatized, but alive. She had fled, terrified, after Jacob's murder, changing her name, hiding from the very men he had fought to expose. When Evelyn and Ben found her, she broke down, overwhelmed with a mix of relief and lingering terror. But seeing Jacob's ledger, seeing the proof, finally freed her from decades of fear. She testified, adding her voice to the truth, her courage a testament to Jacob's sacrifice. Evelyn, with a newfound sense of purpose, decided to stay in St. Augustine. She realized her unique abilities, her meticulous nature, her patience for detail, Her unwavering compassion combined perfectly with Ben's sharp investigative mind and his deep understanding of human nature. They officially partnered, establishing Reed and Crawford Investigations, a small, discreet private practice specializing in cold cases, missing persons, and family mysteries. Their motto, unearthing the echoes of truth. Their office was a bright, airy space in the heart of the historic district, far from the dilapidated old library. It buzzed with the quiet energy of purpose, the hopeful murmur of clients seeking closure. Evelyn found a new rhythm, a new reason to wake each morning, no longer burdened by the past, but invigorated by the present. Sometimes, late in the evening, after a long day of poring over old documents or interviewing reluctant witnesses, Evelyn would walk to the base of the old lighthouse. She would stand there under the vast starlit Florida sky, listening to the gentle lapping of the waves. She would feel Jacob's presence, not as a ghost of grief, but as a guiding light, a silent whisper of pride and affirmation. The city of St. Augustine, once a place of unspeakable tragedy, had become a haven of unexpected purpose, a testament to the enduring power of truth, and a vibrant new chapter in a life reborn. The bus, the Ghost Town Express, had not left her stranded. It had delivered her home.